You know, we walk through forests and we walk through parks and we don't always have our eyes open. And do you know, I have a feeling that nature knows that, doesn't bother to interfere with us. But sometimes something happens. I'll tell you a true story. I was in this forest and I'm fascinated by squirrels. When I first came to Norfolk, I saw a red one. It's the only one I've ever seen. But this was a grey squirrel on this day. And as I was watching, I noticed it was bobbing along and in its mouth it had a little nut, probably a chestnut. It suddenly stopped, and with its paws it started pushing aside leaves that were on the ground, leaves from the autumn trees. And it then started digging and digging and digging and digging. Oh, I could see what it was doing. And then it dropped that chestnut into the hole. And then it covered the hole up. And once it had covered it up, it got its paws and went and pressed on those leaves. And then when it did it again and went until it was nice and tight. And then it looked round at me. And it stared. And as if to say, don't you dare, that's mine. And with that, the squirrel bobbed away. And I watched it go. Well, I thought, there's a thing.
The war was a long war. The soldier, well, he was a good soldier. He was a deadly shot with a rifle. But many wars come to an end, and this war came to an end, and he had to go back home with a week's worth of wages. And in those times you could keep your rifle, and he took his rifle with him. Well, he went back to his hometown, and the first thing that he found out was that his mother and father had died while he'd been fighting. So he went to his brother's house, his oldest brother. His oldest brother took one look at him and didn't want to know, sent him on his way. So he went to his other brother's house. Same thing, he didn't want to know him. So he thought what to do. So he took himself to the only place that he knew he ever felt any comfort from years gone past. He went to that place high up where there was a hill fort. And there was an earthen mound all the way around, and beech trees were growing on the top of it. And he sat down. Dusk was coming, and he just sat there. And then he found that his thoughts began to drift back to the war that he'd been in. He could suddenly hear horses screaming that had been shot. He could hear men calling out for their mother. Mummy, he could hear. And his mind just went off. He was back in the battlefield. And then he was aware of a presence, and he came out of those thoughts, and there was a man, a smart man, standing in front of him. And he looked him up and down. He was dressed in green velvet. And the man said, "You look as if you need some help." And the soldier just looked at him, eyed him up and down. "I can help you," said this man. "How?" said the soldier. "I can give you money." "Huh. What's the deal?" said the soldier. Well, you need to show me that you're brave enough." "Brave enough? I'm a soldier. I'm a deadly shot with a rifle." "We'll see." With a click of his fingers, a black bear came running out of the wood. The soldier, as calm as anything, just lifted his rifle. He waited until the bear was almost upon him, and he shot straight between the eyes, and the bear fell at his feet. "Good shot," said this man. "Good shot, this smart gentleman." And the soldier eyed him up and down, and he went down to his feet, and he could see on one foot was a beautiful, crafted, handmade leather boot, and on the other was a cloven hoof. He knew he was dealing with the devil now. And the soldier thought, well, I'll just go with it. "So what's the deal?" said the soldier. "Well, the deal," said the devil, "is I'll give you 7 years. If in 7 years you can avoid me, your soul will be free. But if you can't, I will take your soul." "Well, what do I have to do?" said the soldier. And the gentleman took off his jacket and said, "Put this jacket on." And the soldier put the jacket on, felt in the pocket, and he could feel coins. Yes, said the devil. It's full of money and it will never run out. You can spend as much as you want and it will never run out. What else do I have to do? And the devil went down with a knife and he skinned that bear, scraped off all the flesh and fat and said, wear this. And he put it over his shoulders. And he said to the soldier, you must wear this bear skin all the time. You must sleep in it. You must not wash or cut your hair. You must not wash or cut your beard. You must not cut your nails for 7 years. If at the end of 7 years you are still in one piece and you are still okay, then you will be free. And the soldier said, okay. And as quick as that, the devil was gone. Well, the first thing that soldier did is he went into the local town and he bought beer and he drank and he drank and he drank. And he spent money on women and he spent money gambling and he drank more beer. And within several weeks, he thought he was having the best time of his life, spending this money, this endless money. But what he also did was, if he ever saw a homeless person or a beggar on the street, he would always give them a coin. And they would say a prayer for him because they could see him. They could see what he was becoming. Well, the months and the years went on. Within 18 months, 2 years, with an unwashed bear skin, unwashed hair and unwashed beard and uncut nails, he began to look like a bear. People were scared of him. People avoided him. Children teased him and he would growl at them. People would try and come up and talk to him and he would growl at them. So people avoided him more and more and more. And the years went on, 4 years, and he was taking himself from town to town to city to town, living that kind of life. People started to refuse to serve him. He found it very difficult to find shelter in places. People wouldn't serve him beer anymore. They wouldn't serve him food. Life became very difficult for him. He came upon an inn one day. He was hungry. The innkeeper stopped him in the doorway. He said, you can't come in. He said, but I'm hungry. Well, you have no money. I have, he said, and he pulled out a handful of gold. I'm hungry. The innkeeper said, there's a barn over there. Go in there and I'll bring you something to eat and some beer. So the man who was now known as Bearskin, people called him Bearskin, Bearskin took himself into the barn and soon the innkeeper came over with a hot meal and some beer. And he ate and he drank his beer and he laid back on the hay there and his mind just went back to the battlefield. And again, he was laying in the mud, the sticky mud, and there was blood running through the mud and he could hear men screaming, he could hear horses screaming, and he was back in that battlefield. And then he could hear someone crying, but it wasn't on the battlefield. It was close to where he was. And he came out of that dream that he was having and he could hear a man crying. And he looked about him and he could see there was a door in the barn to an adjoining part of the barn, and he went through and there was an old man sitting there with his head in his hands crying. The old man looked up and saw him and was about to scream, and Bearskin said, don't scream, please don't be afraid of me. What ails you? Why are you crying, sir? Said Bearskin. I have 3 children, 3 young women. We're about to be evicted. I can't work, I'm too old, I have no more money, we will be put out on the street. Can you imagine 3 young women out on the street with no one to protect them? I can pay for your rent. And with that, he put his hand in his pocket and he brought out a huge handful of gold coins and put them in the man's hand and said, take this. The old man said, this will pay my rent for a year or more and more besides. You must come back to my house. Come back to my house and have something to eat and something to drink. So the old man took Bearskin back to his house. In they went. Well, there were 3 daughters, as I say, that lived there. The 2 oldest, they saw Bearskin and they said, Father, who have you brought here? He stinks. Look at him. He looks like a monster. He looks like a bear. Look at him. Why have you brought him here? And they just took themselves off. The youngest daughter looked at him. And father said, make this man a cup of tea, please, dear, and give him a piece of cake. And she looked at this and she thought, if my father has brought this man here, there must be something good about this man. Anyway, she made him a cup of tea and a piece of cake. They sat at the table and father said, just have a chat with the young man. He had to go and sort something out in the back room. And they were just sat there chatting away, and Bearskin began to tell her about his story and his deal with the devil. And 4 years in, he still had 3 years to go. And they just chatted. And the young woman, well, she met his eyes and she could see something good, something kind in his eyes. She could see beyond what was in front of him. She could see the depth in his, she could see something there, and she warmed to him. Well, she said, I'll wait for you. And Bearskin looked. You'll wait for me? I'll wait for you, she said. He went down into his waistcoat pocket and he had a gold ring. And he broke the ring in half and he gave her half of the ring. He put the other half back in his waistcoat pocket and said, you'll know it's me because they will match. And he finished his tea, he finished his cake, and off he went. As I say, there was 3 more years. Well, something happened to Bearskin because he was no longer wanted in the towns. There was too much trouble. It was too difficult. So he began to take himself to the woods. And he started staying in the woods, sleeping in the woods. And a strange thing happened to him. He found the more time that he spent in the woods, being woken by bird song first thing in the morning and watching deer going through the woods, he could feel a calmness start to come over him. And as the months went past, he began to feel less angry. And he would watch foxes and badgers, cubs playing with each other and just all of the kind of nature around him, the trees changing through the seasons. And he noticed that as the seasons changed, he changed. He could feel a lightness. He could feel, it was as if the more he communed with the animals, the more he was becoming human, the human that he really was. Well, 7 years passed. And he took himself back to where that old hill fort had once been, and he waited for the devil. And the devil just appeared in front of him. I didn't expect that, said the devil. I thought I would have your soul. Give me the jacket. Ha, said Bearskin, the soldier. First, you have to wash my hair and cut it. Then you have to wash my beard and shave me. And then cut my nails. And then you can have the jacket back. And the devil knew he had to do these things, otherwise there would be no deal. So that's what the devil did. And then the soldier just went on his way and the devil was gone. Lost a soul. Well, the young man, the soldier, he went back into that town where he'd met that old man and the 3 daughters. And he got himself a decent set of clothes. He had a little bit of money put to one side. And he went back to that house, hoping that they would still be there. And they were. He knocked on the door. The old man answered the door, didn't recognise him. There stood a smart, clean, strong, good man. And he thought, oh, I'll invite him in. Come in, come in. He thought, maybe he'll be good for one of my daughters as a husband. They're still not married. And he sat him down and he said to his youngest daughter, make this young man a cup of tea and give him a piece of cake. Well, the oldest daughters, they saw him and they began to, well, whatever young women do around a very handsome young man, and they kind of did a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I can't find the words actually, and then they went upstairs to kind of powder their noses and do a little bit more to their hair. And while they were doing that, he sat down at the table and began to drink his tea. And the youngest joined him. And there they were sitting, having tea. And she didn't look at him. She hadn't looked at another man in the last 3 years. And he began to talk to her. And still she didn't look at him. And then he took out half the ring from his waistcoat and he pushed it across the table. and she saw it. She felt around her neck for where she had the half ring. She took it off, and sure enough, it matched. And then she looked him in the eyes. "It's you," she said. "It's you." Well, this is a good story, for soon they were married. And they had a good life, a good marriage. They had several lovely children. But the story doesn't end quite yet. There was a knock at the door one day, and he went to the door, and he opened it. There stood the devil. And the soldier looked the devil in the eye and said, "There'll be no more dealing with me and you. On your way." And he closed the door, and the devil was never seen again.
Once upon a time, over in the fens, the marshmen and the marsh women, they had a hard life, but they loved where they lived, their villages on the edge of the marshes, which were peaty and boggy and full of evil things. There were dead hands, there were witches that rode on peat broomsticks, snags. There were bogarts and bogles. There were strange creatures just called the things. There were will-o'-the-wisps. All of these things lived there, but they didn't come out until the night, until the darkness came. Now the people of the villages, they feared the marshes at night, so they didn't go out unless the moon was full. And this story is really about the moon, because you see, the moon shines her light everywhere. She has no favourites. She is new when she is dark, and then she comes and she goes round her full cycle and becomes bright in the sky. And that was the best time for the marsh people. But the moon heard about these things. She heard about these things in the marshes. And she didn't know whether she believed it or not, that they were quite as bad as the people said. So one night, when her moon was dark, she decided to come down and have a look for herself. So she put her black cloak on and she came down out of the sky and down there into the marshes. And as she walked along the narrow paths with the green and bubbling bog on either side, she began to hear the sounds, the slushing and the moaning. And at one point she slipped and she put her hands out, and suddenly these vines, they came and they wrapped around each one of her arms and they pulled her forwards. And as she did so, her foot slipped into the water and again something grabbed her. She fought really hard, but the more that she pulled, the more these vines held tight around her wrists. After a while, when she was still, she heard the sound of a voice. She could hear a human, somebody crying out for help. And she knew that there was no light on the marshes and that this human would maybe fall in and do the same as she had. If he fell, maybe he'd be dragged under and never seen again. So she started to fight again and she pushed her head back and the cloak hood fell off her head and this light suddenly shone across the marshes and the man could see where he was going, and he found the path and he found his way out of the marshes. Well, the moon, she was pulled back, and now there were witches and bogarts all around her, and they were pushing her and spitting at her and poking her and telling her how they hated her for shining her light so bright that they were not able to do what they wanted to do. And slowly but surely they could feel that the sun was about to rise. And some of the witches, they took a big stone and they put it on top of the moon so that it was half out of the water. And there on a snag, on a tree that was there, they ordered 2 will-o'-the-wisps to hang on each one and to watch and make sure that she did not move. And they left as the sun came up. Now the people of the marshes, for the first few days, they didn't notice, because the moon is dark for 3 days. And then the new moon begins to come, and they put a pebble in their mouth, and they have hazel. They have a hazel wand which they carry with them, and they would put salt across the paths of their cottages and lay straw, and all of these things they believed would bring them luck from the new moon, from this new beginning. But she didn't come. The moon didn't come. She didn't come that day, or the next day, or the next day, or for the week, for 2 weeks. And the people of the marshes, they could feel that the things were coming closer and closer, because now they did not fear the light. They were coming closer and closer. And they went to see the wise woman, the old hen wife who lived at the edge of the village. And she begged them, please, please, what can we do? Where is the moon? And she looked in her scrying mirror, she looked in her book, she looked everywhere she could, and she said, I cannot tell you anything. I cannot see anything. She said, go home with you, put salt along your doorsteps, put salt on your windows, and hold your loved ones close. So they did. One night they were in the inn, and a stranger came in. And this stranger heard the talk about the moon, and suddenly he realised he was the one that had walked across the marshes, and he realised that he had maybe seen the moon that night. So he told them. He said, I've seen the moon, I think. And he told them what he had seen. Well, in an instant they were off over to the wise woman, and they told the wise woman what he had said. And again she looked into her scrying mirror and into her books. And then she looked at them and she said, this is what you must do. You must, all of you, all the people from the village, you must put a stone in your mouth to stop you speaking. You must take the hazel wands. Do not speak. Hold each other tight. You look for a coffin, a cross, and 2 candles. That is what I have seen. And so the people that night, they did what she said. They put a stone, a pebble in their mouth to stop them from speaking. They held their hazel wands, and they held each other's hands as they walked along the narrow paths and tried so hard to ignore the screeches and the callings and the touchings of the things that lived in the marshes. And as they went along, somebody spotted 2 lights. And they made their way towards this, and these lights, they were hanging on this tree, and there was the stone, half in and half out of the water. This was their coffin, their cross, and their candles. In silence, they worked this stone backwards and forwards until they were able to pull it with a great big slurp. It came out, and this light, this face, they saw this face which was so beautiful. They would tell stories about it later. This soft, soft light with a smile that suddenly was gone. But they looked up into the sky, and there in the sky was the full moon shining brightly back down onto the marshes all around them. And they walked back with joy in their hearts, and they went and they told the old woman what had happened. And you can be sure there were celebrations that time. And it is said that from that time on, the moon shines stronger and brighter on the marshes than anywhere else in the country.
The Tzar was in the forest. He was just taking a walk when he heard the most terrifying sound. He began to run. He ran as fast as he could. He ran towards the sound. It got louder and louder. He looked around, but he couldn't see anything. What on earth was it? And then the whole forest shook. He looked up and up and up and up, and beyond the forest he could see the mountains. The Tzar ran as fast as he could go back to the palace. As he got there, there was chaos. There were people running in all directions, and the whole palace was shaking just like the forest. He went down the corridors, he went to the great meeting room, and there they were, sat around the table, running around the table, moving this way and that, looking out the windows. And there was his wife, the beautiful Tsarina. "Husband, where have you been?" "I was in the forest," he explained, "when I heard the sound." "What is it?" "Well, look out there, look at the window." And he looked out the window, and he saw it. There, on the top of the mountain, was a giant. And the giant seemed to have a huge cudgel in his hand, and he was swinging it around and swinging it around, and he was bellowing at the top of his voice, "Send out your champion! Send him up here! Let me fight him! And if you do not, I will come down there and I will destroy your palace and I will kill every one of your people. Send out your champion." So there they sat, around the great table in the meeting hall. All these brave men, these brave women, all warriors, defenders of the Tsardom. And the Tsar sat beside his beautiful Tsarina. Everyone looked scared. Everyone felt scared. And the Tsar stood up and walked around, looked at each one of them and said, "So what is to be done? Who will go and fight the giant?" Nobody answered. They just looked away from the Tsar. And when he asked again, one of them stood up and said, "Your Majesty, the champion should go." Who was the champion? Who won the last great battle, the tournament? And the Tsar stared around the table at each one of those people. Was it a man? Was it a woman? Was it 2 or 3? And when he asked, they all looked away. They looked at their fingers, they looked at the ground, they looked at the table, but they would not look him in the eye. The Tsar stared down the length of the table at his wife. "Tsarina," he said, "there is only one thing to be done. There is no one here, no one, who claims to be the champion. So I will go." "But husband," she said, "you can't go. You are the leader of the people. You are the Tsar. And because I am the Tsar, it is my responsibility. I will go and face this giant. I will not let him come down here. I will do my best. Give me my strongest axe, my sharpest sword. I will fight him." So it was that these things were done. So it was that the Tsar was dressed in armour. So it was that he left the palace. They dropped the drawbridge. They watched him from the high walls. They watched their Tsar go and fight the giant. And all the while, the giant was there with his cudgel waiting for the champion. And the giant looked down and saw someone coming towards him up the mountain. And as for the Tsar, petrified he was. But he was the Tsar after all. He would fight. And he climbed and he climbed and he climbed that mountain. He held that axe and he held the sword. And as he climbed, the higher he went, the strangest things seemed to happen. The further he went. What is this? Up and up he went until he got to the top of the mountain, and there was the giant. Only now, the giant was so small. He had to reach down. He had to reach down and put his hand underneath the giant to lift him up, to be able to see him, because he had become so small. And the Tzar looked at this giant and said, I don't understand. What has happened to you? What is your name? And the giant looked at the Tzar and said, my name is Fear. That is what they call me. I see, said the Tzar. I see. And now that you are so close, I am not scared of you anymore. So there you go. And he let Fear go. And he watched Fear run away until it had vanished. I haven't told that story so many times. But many, many years ago, the first time I ever told it was in a story club in Norwich. And I told many big stories that night. And at the end of it, when you're packing away as a storyteller and you're rolling up this and you're rolling up that and people are leaving, there was one person who was sat at the back. Didn't recognize her. She wasn't part of the club. She was still there. And when I'd finished packing up, she walked over to me and she said, I just want to thank you for the story that you told tonight. And of course I thought she meant the story about the cell key or the story about the Great War. No, she said, not those. No, that little story about the giant and the Tzar, about Fear. I realized that I think that story was for me. You see, many years ago, over 20 years ago, my father died and I had a call from my mother. I had just started in my life. I was becoming a scientist in Cambridge. And my mother rang and she said she was sick and could I come home and look after her. So I did, of course. I was her daughter. But she never wanted to be left. So I stayed. I never went back to my job, she said. I stayed and looked after my mother. All these years I looked after her. And I didn't realize, but I became full of fear. And then my mother died. And I had nothing. At least that's what I thought. I was even scared of going outside, even scared of going down to the shop. And it was one day last week when I went down to the shop, full of fear, that I saw a poster on the wall. And it said storytelling in the church hall. So I came, and here I am. And now I know. Now I know, she said, that I came here for that story. Because I want my fear to run away. I don't want to hear anymore. And with that she thanked me. And she walked out. And I never saw her again. That's the power of stories. And it was the first time that I realized that stories aren't just for entertainment. Stories are about us, about the most fundamental things of life, death, living. Exactly. And if that bird is saying what I think it's saying, that's exactly it. Stories are about us, bringing us home, and understanding that nature, forests, trees, birds, we're all on the same journey. My name is Paul Jackson. I'm blessed to be a storyteller.
Oh, there are some really beautiful trees in these woods here, and there's quite a lot of silver birch, and the silver birch is called the Lady of the Woods. And many years ago, there was a young and poor shepherdess who had lost one of her sheep, and she was walking in the woods trying to find this sheep that had wandered off. And as she walked along, she was picking bits of fleece off of the bushes, the hedges, off the branches, bits of fleece that had come off as the sheep had gone by, and she was just spinning it into wool. And she was walking and walking, and it was starting to get later and darker, and she felt so tired that she decided that she would just rest up just for a little while. And so she found this really beautiful silver birch with a lovely slender trunk, and she just leaned back and rested her weight and her weariness against the trunk of this silver birch. And she was just starting to feel her body relax and starting to feel her eyelids getting heavy, when all of a sudden she heard a voice, a strange creaking voice, but a beautiful voice as well, an old voice, an ancient voice. And the voice was speaking to her. "Hello, child. So nice of you to come to see me." Well, for a moment the young shepherdess thought maybe she was dreaming, she must be imagining this, and then she looked up into the branches of the silver birch and she saw a face, a beautiful face, a face made of wood, an ancient face. And the silver birch continued to speak to her and said, "Oh, my child, will you dance with me? It's been such a long time since I have had a good dance." Well, by now the young shepherdess was starting to feel a little bit worried. She was thinking, this tree is talking to me, I must be going mad. And here she is and she's asking me to dance. I don't know about this. But before she could get up and run away, something in her heart said, this tree, it's been such a long time since she has danced. And you know, when we haven't given our bodies an opportunity to dance in a long time, well, the gift of dancing with somebody is a wonderful thing. And so she said, okay. And so she got up onto her feet and she started to dance and to sway. And as she began to sway, so the silver birch began to sway as well. And she started to move around the trunk of the tree. And now she's really starting to get into the flow of her dance as she's spinning and twirling around the tree, and then suddenly one of the branches reaches out and grabs her really strong, and she's starting to feel quite afraid by now, but then she feels the tree begin to quicken and then to shudder, and then suddenly the silver birch is drawing her roots up out of the earth, and she's dancing. And they're dancing there together in the woods, swaying and twirling and swirling, going faster and faster. And now the young shepherdess, she's starting to get quite out of breath. She's starting to get tired. She wants to stop dancing now, but there is no chance that the dance is going to stop anytime soon. And so they dance as the sun is going down, and they dance. And just as the young shepherdess is about to go, "No, I can't dance anymore," so the dancing begins to slow down, and that silver birch settles her roots back into the ground, and then she scoops the young shepherdess up in her branches and she throws her up in the air, and she catches her in the most gentle cradle, and she caresses her gently with her leaves, and she brushes the hair off of her face and sings the young shepherdess to sleep. And as she sings, she whispers in her ear, "Your wool is spun and your sheep has been found. All is well. And you have given me dances for my dreams that will keep me happy for many, many years." And sometime later, when the shepherdess woke up, she thought that perhaps maybe this had been a dream. And then she remembered something, some words that had been whispered to her while she was asleep. And it was something about the leaves upon the ground and to gather the leaves up, and that good fortune would come her way. And so she took leaves from the ground, the dried birch leaves, and she gathered them up in her apron. And when she looked up, her wool had indeed been spun just as the Lady of the Woods had told her it would be. And it was spun so long and so fine, it was just like silk. And there was her lost sheep waiting by the path. And so she began to make her way through the woods, making her way back home. But as she did, the leaves in her apron, they started to feel heavier and heavier. And when she got home and she emptied out the contents of her apron, every single one of those silver birch leaves had turned into solid silver. And as the wind blew through the trees, she thought that she could hear behind her a leafy laugh carried on the air.